The evening of December 1st, 2018, Auckland, New Zealand. The security cameras of the CityLife Hotel capture the final seconds of Grace Millane alive, 21 years old, an English tourist, the first country of her round-the-world trip, the eve of her 22nd birthday. She's laughing in the elevator next to a man she matched with on Tinder just a few hours earlier. Within a few hours, her life will end in a room on the 11th floor. And the next morning, the man beside her will be typing into a search engine, the hottest kind of fire, and large bags nearby. And that same evening, he'll go on another date through the same app. How an ordinary match turned into a high-profile criminal case, and why the defense spent 3 weeks trying to call it an accident. Grace Emmy Rose Millane was born in the English county of Essex, in the small town of Wickford, where almost everyone knows each other by sight. She was 21. Behind her was a freshly earned degree from the University of Lincoln in marketing and advertising. On her mind wasn't the next office job opening. It was a map of the world. Like many graduates of British universities, she decided to take a pause. A year between studies and work, something British culture has long given its own name. A gap year. A year when you can pack a backpack, buy a one-way ticket, and see how the world is arranged beyond Wickford. She chose the first country of this route deliberately. New Zealand is considered one of the safest places on the planet. English language, a calm society, beautiful nature, well-developed tourist infrastructure. Her parents felt at ease. Her friends envied her. In November 2018, Grace flew into Auckland, the country's largest city. It was November 20th. Ahead of her lay weeks of freedom, plans to travel south across the entire North Island, then take a ferry to the South Island, then, perhaps, further on, to Asia. She settled into a hostel in central Auckland. She kept up her Instagram, posting shots of the waterfront, the ocean, city streets. Every day she sent messages to her parents, short ones, with photos, in her usual tone. On December 2nd, she would turn 22. A video call with the family in England had been scheduled for that day in advance. Her parents were already getting ready to wish their daughter a happy birthday through a screen, trying to time it to her time zone. On Grace's phone was the Tinder app, the standard way for her generation to meet locals in an unfamiliar city. Nothing in these everyday routines hinted that the first country of her round-the-world route would also be her last. On Saturday, December 1st, 2018, a new match appeared in this app. A young man with a neat photo, a short bio, and an age of 27. He introduced himself to Grace under a name that would later turn out to be fake. In reality, in front of her was Jesse Shane Kempson, a local Auckland resident. To Tinder, he was just another match profile among thousands of others. Grace saw none of what stood behind that profile. She didn't see the police files in which his name already appeared. She didn't see the women who had gone through the same process before her. An app meeting, a date in the city, an evening after which some of them had reason to contact the police. She didn't see the history of aggression trailing behind him long before this Saturday evening. She saw a smiling face on a screen and a polite message in English. Tinder is not required to check the background of its users. It isn't linked to police databases, doesn't know about prior complaints, doesn't ask how many times a man has already ignored someone else's no. Grace found herself one-on-one with a profile with no past. The conversation ran smoothly and in a friendly tone. They agreed to meet that same evening in the very center of Auckland, on the city's main artery, Queen Street. Grace told friends and acquaintances in a group chat that she was going on a regular date. She described her companion in one short sentence: nice guy. Not the slightest warning sign, not a single word that later, when her story would be broken down minute by minute, could look like a premonition. She got ready, put on makeup, and left the hostel to head into a Saturday night in a foreign country. She left the hostel and walked to Queen Street. The meeting happened around 5:30 in the evening. The day was still bright. In December, New Zealand lives by the summer calendar, and the sun sets late. Both of them looked relaxed. From that minute, the story stopped being private and turned into a sequence of frames from surveillance cameras, which within a week would be handled by a whole team of investigators. The pair moved around the bars of the city center. They dropped by venues inside the Sky City complex, one of the most famous spots in Auckland. Then they moved on to Andy's bar and lingered a bit at a couple of other places. Every move they made was recorded by dozens of cameras. In some bars, the footage was high quality, in others grainy, but still good enough for identification. In this footage, you can see them talking, laughing, holding hands. In some venues, they stood next to each other at the bar. In others, they sat across a table. They embraced on the street, and the embrace looked like the embrace of two people who felt good together. There isn't a single frame where Grace looks frightened or tense. That would later become part of the tragedy. An ordinary evening never looks like a last one. Around 9:30, they approached one of the Auckland hotels, the CityLife, on Queen Street. Closer to 10 in the evening, the lobby cameras recorded them going in. They crossed the reception, walked to the elevators, and rode up to the 11th floor. These are the last images of Grace Millane alive. In the recording, she's smiling. At the moment the elevator doors close, she still doesn't know anything of what the man beside her knows. The elevator doors close, and from there begins the stretch of the story, for which there isn't a single camera and not a single independent witness. Kempson's room was on the 11th floor of the CityLife Hotel. It was an ordinary city room. A bed, a wardrobe, a small bathroom, a window looking out onto central Auckland. Everything that happened over the next few hours would later be reconstructed from only two sources. The first, Kempson's own words, which he would change and rewrite as the investigation and trial went on. The second, Grace's body, which experts would later examine. According to the prosecution's findings, during the night between December 1st and 2nd, in the room on the 11th floor, Grace's life was ended as a result of Kempson's deliberate actions, not a chance accident. Experts at the trial would point out that the nature of the injuries was inconsistent with an accidental error during intimacy. Her death came on the eve of her 22nd birthday. In England, given the time difference, her parents at that moment were still getting ready for the morning in which they planned to wish their daughter a happy birthday. The neighbors on the floor heard nothing suspicious. The hotel at that hour was operating normally. The reception was checking in late guests, the corridors were empty, the elevator was moving between floors as usual. No one called security. No one knocked on the door of the room. From the outside, the night at the CityLife Hotel was no different from any other Saturday night. The night in the room passed without any further action from Kempson. According to investigators, he stayed in the same space until morning. He knew that beyond the door was the ordinary world, which would start asking questions at dawn. And he was already thinking about what he'd do with his answer when the first rays appeared in the window. With the first rays, he picked up his phone. What he did over the next hour would later become the prosecution's main argument. A man who would later claim a tragic accident had occurred behaves nothing like someone beside whom a life has just ended. He launched a series of search queries. They would later be quoted word for word. Among them, lines about the hottest type of fire, a query about Waitakere Ranges National Park west of Auckland, a query about large bags nearby, separate lines about large birds of prey in New Zealand. Each of these phrases, taken alone, look strange. Put together, they form a single logical line: how to hide the traces of what happened and how to move a body outside the city. These aren't the queries of a confused man who has just been through something horrific. This isn't panic, not an attempt to call for help, not a search for the nearest hospital. This is logistics, applied and quick. It didn't take him days or even hours of thought. All of it happened in the course of a single morning. Add to that what investigators already knew in advance. In the days before meeting Grace, his browser history contained other queries, linked to those same risky practices the defense would later try to pass off as an accident. In court, the prosecution would line up these two layers into one continuous thread: preparation before, logistics after, and in the middle, the night in which, according to the prosecution, nothing accidental could have happened. The defense would later explain the morning searches as panic. The jurors would listen to that version carefully. But against the backdrop of receipts, cameras, and forensic evidence, the story of a man who got confused would fall apart. For now, Kempson closed the browser and stepped out onto the streets of Auckland. He stepped out onto the streets of Auckland and started an ordinary, mundane-looking Saturday of shopping. For a regular person, these would be standard purchases. For investigators, this would become a set of physical evidence. Over the course of December 2nd, Kempson walked into a store and bought a large travel suitcase. At another place, he picked up a shovel. At yet another, special cleaning products for carpet and car interiors. He paid for every purchase with a bank card, not cash, not through a middleman, a card in his own name. Every transaction stamped itself onto the bank statement. Store cameras captured his face, his walk, his clothes, his basket. Later, detectives would line up this route into a single chain, from the suitcase shelf to the checkout, and lay it out in the courtroom. In parallel with this, he opened Tinder and was messaging another woman. This wasn't some abstract activity in an app. This was a concrete conversation with a concrete person, which led to scheduling a meeting. On the evening of December 2nd, the very day when Grace was supposed to be celebrating turning 22, Kempson went out on a date with a new acquaintance. They met at a cafe, an ordinary conversation, an ordinary evening. For her. For him, it was the second meeting within 24 hours arranged through the same app. This woman would later become one of the prosecution's key witnesses. She would describe the appearance of the man who, 24 hours earlier, had been sitting in an elevator with Grace. She would describe his mood, his manner, his words. Her testimony would go into the record as one of the most inconvenient pieces of evidence for the defense, because the version of "he was in shock from what happened" is very hard to hold up when in parallel the man is carrying on a new conversation on Tinder and meeting in person at a cafe. While Grace's family was waiting for the scheduled call, Kempson was already constructing the appearance of an ordinary day. While he was building the illusion of a normal evening, an unresolved part of the plan still remained in the room on the 11th floor. The morning search queries had already pointed the direction. West of Auckland, a dense national park, a large bag that could hide a lot. Grace's body was placed into that very suitcase, bought the day before. Then came the transport. Kempson got behind the wheel and drove out of Auckland, heading toward the west coast. The road led away from city blocks, wound through hills, pushed deeper into green stretches of forest. The destination, the Waitakere Ranges. This isn't a tourist corner, but a large nature park where under the canopy of trees you can easily lose your bearings. The very park he had been typing into the search bar that morning. In one of the less traveled patches of the forest, he left the suitcase. The burial was shallow, done quickly, with no attempt at careful concealment. For a man who wants what was found never to be identified, it was too careless. For a man who believes a few days will be enough to get away, it was enough. The shovel, bought the day before, did its job. After that, he went back to the same road and drove back to the city. By nightfall, he was back in Auckland. He went on living an ordinary life. Work, conversations, apps on his phone, the usual routes. On paper and on camera, he had the everyday life of a young New Zealander. In substance, these were the days of a man who had just left another person's body in the woods. The New Zealand police, at this point, had not yet been brought in. A country where the disappearance of a young foreign woman would soon become the top story did not yet know her name. In Wickford, her family also did not yet know what was coming. Between the killer's calculation and the parents' alarm, only a few days remained. And those days would start with one simple observation: silence where silence wasn't supposed to be. December 2nd, Grace's birthday. In Wickford, her parents were preparing for that very video call they had agreed on in advance. They adjusted for the time zone, picked a convenient time, opened the messenger. On the screen, an empty chat, no call, no messages. At first it could still be explained. A long night in another city, an excursion, bad internet at the hostel, a dead phone. These things happened to travelers. Grace could take care of herself. She was 22, she was an adult. But hours went by, and the silence started to ring. Her parents wrote again. They tried to call, they checked her Instagram, where before there had been short stories, shots of the waterfront, breakfasts at cafes. The feed was silent. That daily stream of small things, through which her life was visible, cut off right on the evening of December 1st. Not a single post on the 2nd or the 3rd. For someone who had been sharing every day up to that point, this was abnormal. By December 5th, the family made a decision that changed everything. They contacted the New Zealand police and asked them to launch a search. On that same day, the story hit the national media. A country where such cases are rare reacted immediately. A photograph of a smiling English girl with long hair appeared on TV news, on the front pages of newspapers, in social media. The disappearance of Grace Millane was talked about not as a routine report, but as an incident of national scale. At the same time, the British side came into it. The Essex police coordinated with their New Zealand colleagues. The British press ran the story. The media of Auckland and Wellington shared data. One shared image of a young woman in a blue t-shirt was suddenly being looked at by the entire country. Where she had spent her last evening, with whom, where she had gone after that. These three questions became the main ones for investigators over the next 24 hours, and the first thread they would pull on was already in their hands. It was her own phone and her own Tinder. Phone, Tinder, cameras. Three sources from which, within a few days, the entire picture of Grace's last evening came together. Investigators gained access to her digital trail. The conversation in the app showed her last match, the man she had agreed to meet on the evening of December 1st. Tinder, at the police's request, handed over the account data. At the same time, forensic specialists began reviewing the footage from the cameras on Queen Street. Thousands of hours of video, dozens of locations, hours of painstaking work. Familiar frames kept surfacing on the screens. The couple in a bar, the couple on the street, the couple by the elevator of the CityLife hotel. The man's face in the recordings was matched with the photo from the app account. Then the police database was brought in. In it surfaced a real name, Jesse Shane Kempson, a local resident, age 27, a history of contact with law enforcement. The picture came together faster than usual because every step this man had taken over the past day had been documented by someone else's systems. His CCTV, his bank, his receipts, his geolocation. On December 8th, a week after the evening on Queen Street, Kempson was detained in Auckland. In his first statements, he tried to get by with a generic version. They met. They parted. What happened to her after that? He didn't know. Investigators laid out on the table the first footage from the CityLife hotel cameras. It showed the couple going into the lobby together and riding up to the 11th floor. Grace leaving the hotel wasn't captured by a single camera. The "we parted" version collapsed in the first hour. He began changing his statements. A version about an accident during intimacy appeared. Then explanations of why he'd driven the suitcase into the forest. On December 9th, based on his words and other evidence, police went out to the Waitakere Ranges. Grace Millane's body was found inside the suitcase, in a shallow grave among the trees. The news spread instantly. In England, the family received the news they had feared from that first silence. The news from which the family could not recover for a long time turned into criminal case files. The trial began in November 2019 at the High Court in Auckland and lasted about 3 weeks. In the courtroom, two versions of a single night on the 11th floor collided. The prosecution built its line on physical and digital traces, camera footage from Queen Street and from the CityLife Hotel, receipts for the suitcase, the shovel, and the cleaning products, bank statements with dates and times, browser history with queries about the hottest kind of fire, about the national park, about large bags, about large birds of prey. Forensic examination that documented the nature of the injuries as inconsistent with an accidental movement. Experts in the room explained to the jurors that such injuries could not have arisen from a single short episode and required prolonged force. The defense put forward a different construction. In their version, everything that happened in the room was the result of an intimate game that went wrong, a so-called agreement that collapsed, an attempt to shift the center of gravity of the story from the man's actions onto the victim herself. That line immediately triggered a wave of outrage. Journalists in Auckland and London wrote that she was literally being put on trial after her death. On social media, a discussion flared up about the defense crossing an ethical line. The prosecution responded with two blows. The first, Kempson's browser queries long before meeting Grace. Devoted to exactly those same risky practices, the defense was now trying to pass off as an accident. That wasn't a reaction in the moment, but an interest that existed in advance. The second, the testimony of the woman he'd met through Tinder the day after Grace's death. Her voice in the courtroom made the accident version practically unusable. For 3 weeks, the courtroom listened to these two stories in parallel. The jury went off to deliberate. All of Auckland, all of English Essex, and the part of the world that reads the news were waiting for a single decision. That decision came on November 22, 2019. The jury returned to the courtroom and unanimously declared Jesse Kempson guilty. At that moment, the room fell silent first. And then the quiet weeping of Grace's relatives could be heard. In the public gallery sat dozens of people, most of whom had never met her. For them, that day was a small point of justice in a string of grim news the country had been living with for almost a year. In February 2020, the same court handed down the sentence: life imprisonment, a minimum term of 17 years with no possibility of early release. The judge, in his remarks, paused specifically on what had happened on the morning of December 2nd. He spoke not only of the death itself, but of the convicted man's cynical behavior the following day: the shopping, the new date through an app, the lies to investigators. It was precisely this behavior, in the court's view, that ruled out any version of an accident followed by panic. Grace's parents gave a short speech. They thanked the New Zealand police, thanked the judicial system, and the people who had supported them throughout the year. They did not speak words of hatred. They spoke about their daughter, about her plans, her dreams, and the smile that was no longer there. There was also a second important moment at this stage, which the wider public wouldn't find out about right away. The name of the convicted man, by court order, was temporarily hidden under a publication ban. In New Zealand media, he was referred to as the man convicted in the death of Grace Millane. The reason for that measure was parallel criminal proceedings over his earlier episodes involving other women. The court did not want public perception of one case to influence the course of the others. The ban stayed in place for an entire year. Only in December 2020 was it lifted. And then the country finally got the chance to say out loud the name that until then had only sounded inside closed courtrooms: Jesse Shane Kempson. As soon as the name was spoken aloud, the second layer of this story opened up. Materials that had been sitting in closed folders all this time finally became public. It turned out that Grace Millane had not been the only woman to have crossed paths with Kempson. Before her, there were others. In total, he received another 9 convictions in cases linked to serious offenses against women. These episodes belonged to the period before the meeting on Queen Street. Some of the victims had gone to the police beforehand. Others, only after the name of the central defendant became a national topic, and they found the strength and the courage to speak. A pattern emerged that frightened people more than the sentences themselves. For years, this man had been using Tinder and other dating apps as a constant instrument for finding victims. He picked out women who were in the city briefly: tourists, newcomers, those who didn't have a solid social network in Auckland. One of his victims described his manner in the same words as the woman who met him on Tinder the day after Grace's death: charming, attentive, able to win you over in the first 10 minutes of conversation. The publication of these cases sparked a new wave of discussion. In New Zealand, in the United Kingdom, and beyond, people began seriously debating the fact that dating platforms bear almost no responsibility for the background of their users. They don't cross-check data against police databases. They don't warn you if someone has already had complaints filed against them. The user is left alone with a profile that could hide anyone behind it. The BBC released a documentary project. Netflix included Grace's story in a series of films about the risks of online dating. Podcasts appeared, articles, long-form journalistic investigations. In all of them, one phrase kept surfacing and would go on echoing for years: this story is not about bad luck. This is the story of a systemic hole into which a young woman who had set out to see the world fell. For those who had waited for justice, the sentences were an important part of the closure, but not all of it. The rest of this story lives not in the courtroom. It lives in a house in English Wickford, where a photograph of a smiling girl sits on a dresser in the living room. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, at an early stage, stepped in front of the television cameras and personally apologized to the Millane family. She said her country should have ensured the safety of a young guest and had failed to do so. For a politician at that level, a public apology over a specific case is a rare gesture. It became one of the symbols of how this story moved through New Zealand society. In Auckland, in London, and in several other cities, vigils were held. On squares and along waterfronts, thousands of people lit candles, most of whom had never known Grace. In their hands, her photographs on cardboard signs, her name. This wasn't theater. It was a collective acknowledgement. What happened to one foreign student could have happened to almost any woman. Grace's father, David Millane, at every stage of the process carried himself with restraint and dignity. He spoke little, without emotion, without grand words. In December 2020, he would be gone. He passed away from illness just a few weeks after the name of the man convicted in his daughter's case had first appeared in New Zealand newspapers. That loss became a second heavy blow to the family in a short sequence of events. In memory of Grace, her relatives set up a charity fund. Its work is aimed at helping young women who travel alone, on safe accommodation, on training in basic rules, on crisis support in foreign countries. The case itself became a starting point in a larger conversation about the safety of online dating, about what platforms ought to check, about how societies protect solo female travelers, about why the defense in the courtroom tried to shift part of the responsibility onto the victim herself, and why that should no longer work. And Grace Emmy Rose Millane forever remains the woman who was smiling in the elevator of the CityLife Hotel at 11 o'clock on the evening of December 1st. A few hours before her own birthday turned into a date her loved ones would remember in a completely different way. A 24-year-old Menards cashier finishes her shift in Lincoln and drives to the small town of Wilber for a second Tinder date. A day earlier, the woman she's been chatting with, together with her live-in partner, 28 years older, makes a very telling purchase at Home Depot. 3 weeks later, on a gravel road in Clay County, investigators will find the evidence that turns the case around. This is the story of Sydney Loofe, the young woman who became not the first, but the one who didn't walk away. Why this couple spent months picking a victim through a dating app, and what exactly made their trap work. We'll break it down hour by hour. November 15th, 2017. The city of Lincoln, Nebraska. An ordinary weekday at a Menards hardware store. One of those massive American chains that sells screws, patio furniture, and Christmas lights all under the same roof. Behind one of the registers stands a young woman with a short haircut and a friendly smile. Her name is Sydney Loofe. She's 24 years old, and for her, this is just another shift at work. Sydney greets the regulars, rings up receipts, trades a few words with coworkers at the next register. Nothing out of the ordinary. Toward the end of her shift, she pulls out her phone and texts her mother a short, everyday message. No complaints, no anxiety, just the kind of small talk that passes between a grown daughter and parents who live in another Nebraska town. Then she says goodbye to her colleagues and walks out to the parking lot. In the car, Sydney opens Tinder. Ahead of her is a second date with a woman who goes by Audrey. That's how the profile she matched with a few days earlier introduced herself. The first date had been the evening before, on November 14th, and it had gone well. They'd talked, laughed, and Sydney had agreed to meet again. Now she's heading to the neighboring town of Wilber, about 40 miles south of Lincoln, a quiet place of a few thousand residents where Audrey, according to her, rents an apartment. Sydney sends a quick text to a friend saying she's on her way to a date. She gets behind the wheel, buckles up, and pulls out of the parking lot. Traffic cameras at the city's edge catch her car, an ordinary silhouette on an ordinary route. This is the last time she will be seen alive by coworkers, family, or passing strangers. The next morning, she won't show up for her shift at Menards. And out of this quiet, utterly unremarkable disappearance will grow a case that American media will boil down for years to one short phrase: the Tinder killer case. For now, Sydney is just driving toward Wilber, with no idea what's waiting for her in a rented apartment on the edge of a small town. To understand the scale of what happens next, you have to understand who this young woman was, the one who didn't come home from that date. Sydney Loofe grew up in a small town in southern Nebraska, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, where the school, the church, and the grocery store all sit on the same street. Her family was completely ordinary: parents, an older sister, dinners at home, family photos on the fridge, nothing that anyone would later call a difficult background. About 2 years earlier, Sydney had moved to Lincoln, the state capital and Nebraska's second largest city after Omaha. She rented a place with roommates and took the job at Menards. Nothing flashy, but stable. A predictable schedule, co-workers, enough income to pay her bills and plan her life. The people who worked with her all described her the same way: cheerful, calm, reliable, not the type to vanish without a word, not the type to get mixed up in shady stories. Sydney was open about her sexuality. She dated women, used dating apps, just like millions of other young women her age across the country. There was no criminal past, no debts, no strange connections, no exes calling in the middle of the night, no red flags anyone could later latch onto and say, this is the point where she should have been on guard. Her world was her mother and father back in her hometown, her sister, a few close friends, and her co-workers at Menards. Her days were filled with shifts, conversations, social media, ordinary evenings. It's that very ordinariness that would later become the most chilling part of her case for the whole country. Sydney fit the profile of any one of us, young, friendly, open to new connections. And if this could happen to her, it could happen to any woman who opens a dating app tomorrow. The couple that picked her out on Tinder was looking for exactly that kind of woman. Ordinary, trusting, with no security and no readiness for the worst. And it's exactly that kind of woman, ordinary and open, that Sydney finds in the app. In the fall of 2017, a profile pops up on her Tinder belonging to a young woman named Audrey, 23 years old, from the small town of Wilber in the same state, with a handful of ordinary photos, a smile, a shot outdoors, a car selfie. Nothing strange, nothing off-putting, the same kind of profile as thousands of other users. Behind the name, Audrey is Bailey Boswell. She really is 23. She really does live in Wilber, but her actual life has almost nothing to do with the name on the app. In messages, she's easygoing, attentive, good at keeping a conversation going. She asks questions, shows interest, laughs at jokes, sends casual photos. She does exactly what would work on anyone on the other side of the screen. She creates the impression that she's normal, alive, safe. The woman meeting a woman framing plays in her favor. For many women, meeting another woman from an app feels less unsettling than meeting a man. Several of the usual filters of caution come down right away. Sydney and the people around her see Audrey as just another match from an app. In reality, Boswell has a turbulent past behind her. Cities she bounced between, money troubles, shady connections. But none of that appears in the chat. On the app, she projects exactly the image she needs for the next step. And that step looks ordinary too. She suggests meeting up, first in Lincoln, then in her own town of Wilber. Quieter there, more comfortable, she says, and she has an apartment. Sydney sees no reason to say no. Nothing in the profile, nothing in the messages, nothing in the tone gives her pause. But on the other end of the app, Boswell is not alone. Next to her is a man Sydney knows nothing about yet, and he is the one shaping the scenario she is already being drawn into. Gently, but with purpose. That man's name is Aubrey Trail. He is 51 years old. 28 years separate him from Boswell. A gap that by itself makes a person look twice, but that Sydney, of course, knows nothing about. Trail isn't on Tinder. There are no photos of him in Audrey's profile, and nothing in the chats would have ever tipped the young woman from Lincoln off that her match had a live-in partner of that age. Trail's biography is a long list of run-ins with law enforcement, fraud, antique theft, check forgery, prison time in several states. He isn't a stray civilian who lost his way. For years, he'd been living by rules he set for himself. By 2017, Trail and Boswell are living in the small town of Wilber. They rent an apartment, keep to themselves, and don't draw much attention from the neighbors. Investigators would later reconstruct what the dynamic inside this couple really was. The structure was rigid, Trail dominated, Boswell obeyed, and he set the rules. The idea of looking for women through dating apps belonged to him, not her. Boswell was the face people saw on Tinder. Trail was the center of gravity, staying in the shadows and deciding what came next. By Trail's own admissions, which would later be heard in court, the idea of the crime had been discussed inside the couple long before Sydney entered the picture. It wasn't an impulse. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a sudden flash of violence. It was a scenario slowly taking shape inside the head of a 50-year-old man and in the messages of a 23-year-old woman, and they were looking for the right person to fit into it. This division of roles made the couple more dangerous than any lone actor. One person on an app has a harder time creating the illusion of safety and getting someone back to their apartment. Together, they were more convincing. Boswell worked as the bait, Trail as the executor. And they weren't just living this way. As it would later come out, they had already tried before, with other women, who, for one reason or another, had managed to walk away. By the time Sydney appeared in Boswell's messages, the couple already had practice. Investigators reconstructed this later, from witness statements, from match histories on their accounts, from the recollections of the women themselves. Before November 2017, Boswell had matched on Tinder with at least 4 other women. Each of them was around Sydney's age or a little older, young, open, active on dating apps. With some, nothing went beyond a few messages. With others, it got as far as an actual meeting, coffee, a walk, a ride in a car. Several times Boswell brought her matches to Wilber, to that same apartment where she lived with Trail. He would appear there too. The atmosphere shifted quickly and became strange. An older man, a rigid hierarchy inside the couple, conversations that went well past the boundaries of a normal first date. Every one of these women felt, in her own way, that something was off. One slipped out under the excuse of work. Another declined to stay for the rest of the evening. A third said a friend was waiting for her. A fourth simply stopped answering messages. None of them went to the police. At the time, the meetings felt uncomfortable, unsettling, weird, but not criminal. Just a bad app date, the kind that happens to a lot of people and rarely turns into a report. For the couple, those meetings weren't failures. They were rehearsals. They adjusted Boswell's behavior in the chats, tweaked the script for the first night, stripped out the details that scared people off. Trail did the editing. By the time Sydney showed up in the app, the scenario was polished, and on the surface it looked even calmer, even more natural. These 4 women would learn the role they had played from the news, once the Loofe case exploded in national media. For investigators, their statements became what separated a random crime from a planned hunt. They proved one thing. The couple was operating systematically. Sydney hadn't been their first attempt. She was the one who, for some reason, didn't get the chance to walk away. On November 14th, 2017, the day before Sydney would drive to Wilber for the second time, the couple does something that will later become one of the heaviest pieces of evidence in the case. They drive to Home Depot, a major hardware chain. The camera at the entrance captures 2 ordinary-looking shoppers. Inside the store, they move down the aisles calmly, without rushing, like any couple gearing up to fix or redo something in their apartment. Their cart fills with a very specific set of items: tools, a roll of plastic sheeting, heavy-duty trash bags, cleaning supplies, gloves. Taken individually, each of these items is harmless. Hundreds of people buy them every day for construction, cleaning, home repairs. But taken together, the combination matches exactly what you would need to cover up the traces of a serious crime. They pay by card. The register prints a receipt. In the store's system, there's now an electronic record: the date, the exact time, the list of items, the payment method, the transaction number. The couple grabs their bags and drives back to Wilber. None of the employees give them a second look. Ordinary customers on an ordinary day. But here's what matters. That same day, November 14th, is also the day of Sydney's first date with Boswell, which means the tools were bought before Sydney had even agreed to meet again. This wasn't improvisation. It wasn't a reaction to something that happened during the evening. It was preparation, carried out in advance for a person who hadn't even given her consent yet. Investigators would later lay out the timeline hour by hour. First, the trip to the store, then the first date, where Boswell played the part of an ordinary match, then the invitation for a second evening, in Wilber at the apartment. The Home Depot receipts destroy any attempt at a defense built around a fight that got out of hand or a tragic accident. They prove one thing. The meeting on November 15th had been planned coldly in advance. November 15th, evening. Sydney finishes her shift, gets into her car, and drives to a supermarket in Lincoln, where she agreed to meet Audrey. Boswell is already waiting in the parking lot. Cameras catch Sydney transferring into Boswell's car, on her own, calmly, with no trace of coercion. That detail matters. Everything Sydney does from here on is voluntary, under the full belief that she's going on an ordinary date. They head south from Lincoln toward Wilber, 40 miles of quiet Nebraska roads, fields, scattered farms. The conversation in the car isn't known to us, but one thing is clear. Right up until the final minute, Boswell keeps up the image of a harmless date. Wilber is a town of about 2,000 people. The apartment Trail and Boswell rent sits off to the side of the busier areas and doesn't draw attention. Sydney steps inside. Boswell greets her. Trail is already inside. Investigators would later reconstruct the events approximately based on details of the apartment, Trail's courtroom admissions, and expert reports. The atmosphere shifts quickly. What began as a date turns into the execution of a scenario prepared in advance. Trail uses force. By his own courtroom testimony, it is that evening and in that room that Sydney Loofe loses her life. No neighbors report hearing screams. No 911 calls are logged that night. The town goes to sleep. The apartment's windows stay closed, and the light stays on longer than usual. What comes next is the hardest part of the night, and we won't go into those details here. Investigators would reconstruct them from the Home Depot purchases and from what would later be found along a gravel road. The couple works all night. By morning, Sydney has vanished from the sight of anyone who might have cared about her. From her last message to her friend to this moment, only a few hours have passed. November 16th, morning. The workday begins at Menards. Registers open, employees push their carts out onto the floor. Lights come on across the departments. Co-workers notice right away. Sydney isn't there. Her register is empty, her phone goes to voicemail. No one has gotten a message from her. For the people who work with her every day, this isn't a normal late arrival. Sydney isn't the type to miss a shift without a call or a text. She is reliable, responsible, always lets someone know if she's running behind. Her co-workers call her first, then her roommate, the young woman Sydney shares an apartment with back in Lincoln. The roommate realizes Sydney never came home. Her bed is empty, her things are still there, but she isn't. The last thing the roommate knows is that Sydney had gone to a date in Wilber. Together with her co-workers, she tries to reconstruct the route, checks social media, messages mutual friends, no response. That same day, a missing persons report is filed with the Lincoln police. Her parents learn what's happening from the small town where they live. Her mother and father get a short phone call, and after that call, their normal life splits into before and after. The family agrees to share a photo of their daughter, short hair, a smile, the Menards uniform shirt. The image spreads across social media and gets picked up by local news. At this stage, no one is saying the word crime yet. The official language is missing. Dozens of scenarios are still on the table, and statistics make each of them plausible. An accident, a mental health crisis, a runaway, a deliberate silence. But the people closest to her and her co-workers refuse to accept any of those versions from the start. They keep repeating one phrase: Sydney simply would not have disappeared on her own. That phrase becomes the first anchor of the case. It keeps the attention of the police, the media, and ordinary people going just long enough for the chain to start unraveling. For 19 days, all of Nebraska, and then all of the country, will be following the same question. What happened to the young woman who went on a date and never came home? Investigators start with what they have within reach: the missing woman's phone. In her cloud, Sydney has saved messages, photos, location data. Very quickly, investigators see it. The final day of her life is tied to a dating app. Her recent contacts include a match with a profile named Audrey, a short acquaintance, a few days of active messaging, an agreement to meet in Wilber. Police send an official request to Tinder. The platform turns over the account data tied to a real person: first name, last name, phone number. Audrey turns out to be Bailey Boswell, living in Wilber. Trail's name surfaces almost immediately through her address. He's registered at the same apartment and is already well known to state law enforcement from earlier cases. From the beginning, investigators have two specific people. In parallel, forensic analysts reconstruct Sydney's movements. Cameras at the edges of Lincoln show her car, then the meeting in the supermarket parking lot, then the switch into another vehicle. Traffic cameras catch the route heading toward Wilber. By the end of the first week, investigators understand pretty precisely where Sydney went and with whom. Officers head to the apartment in Wilber, but the occupants are already gone. The door is locked, some of their belongings are gone, the windows are dark. Neighbors say that in the last few days, the couple had their lights on late at night, their car sat in the yard, and then they quietly moved out without leaving a forwarding address. When investigators step inside the apartment, they note signs of recent cleaning, far more thorough than ordinary housework. The picture starts to come together into a first theory. Sydney had been in this apartment. Something happened to her here, but there's still no body, no physical proof of a crime, only circumstantial evidence and vanished suspects. Officially, it's still a missing persons case, even though internally, police are already working a different theory. Now investigators have two tasks at once. The first, find Sydney. The second, find the couple that left her route and ditched their phones. The second task is picked up by the Federal Bureau. The FBI enters the case. While the FBI and Nebraska police are looking for them, Boswell and Trail are heading south. They cross the state line and end up in Kansas. They live in campgrounds, cheap motels, their car. They try to stay invisible, but they can't handle the silence. Instead of simply disappearing, they start talking to the camera. Short videos begin showing up online. In them, Boswell and Trail speak directly to the viewer. They say they have nothing to do with Sydney's disappearance. They claim they're being framed. They repeat that the police and the media are twisting everything. The tone is defiant, almost theatrical. The way people act when they're trying to manage public opinion and rewrite the story in their favor. The videos spread instantly. They air on national networks. Hosts discuss them on air, break them down frame by frame, push them into headlines. For the wider audience, this is the first time they see the couple's faces. For investigators, it's a gift. FBI analysts and forensic specialists dissect the clips for details. In the background, they look for geography, trees, signs, wall textures, distinctive objects. In the audio, they look for accents, background noises, the echo of rooms. On the faces, they run comparisons against actual biometric photos of Trail that law enforcement databases already have. The search radius narrows fast. At the same time, the couple keeps committing minor offenses. They need money. They need fuel and food. That's what gives them away. They land on the radar of local police in Kansas for reasons that, on paper, have nothing to do with the Sydney Loofe case. On November 30th, 2017, they are arrested. At the moment of arrest, they have not yet been charged with murder. Officially, they're in custody on other charges: petty fraud, suspicion of financial crimes. But Nebraska investigators are already on their way. From this point on, the FBI has the faces, the location, and the link to Sydney's disappearance. The hardest part remains: finding her. Search teams return to the state's rural areas and begin methodically combing the roads around Wilber and the neighboring towns. On December 4th and 5th, 2017, search teams from the FBI and local police fan out across the rural roads of southern Nebraska. The search zone is Clay County, in the area around the small town of Edgar. That's about 60 miles from the apartment in Wilber where Sydney had spent her last evening. Open fields, gravel, tree lines, a handful of farms. The first discovery is made near the edge of a gravel road, a black plastic trash bag. Inside, items that are identified from photographs the family had provided. Sydney's clothes, things from her car. Evidence that confirms the investigation is moving in the right direction. Over the course of 2 days, searchers find several more bags. All of them are scattered along the same road, a few yards apart, clearly tossed from a car moving down that road. Identification confirms it. This is Sydney Loofe. According to expert findings, the body had been separated into 14 fragments. 13 of them are recovered during these days of searching. One piece, the upper left arm, is never found. For the family, this news ends the days of hope. Her mother, her father, her sister, her friends and co-workers all learn it at the same time. The search is over. There is an answer. But the answer brings no relief. It only trades one kind of weight for another. Now they have to live with knowing. For investigators, a new phase begins. Physical evidence is collected, lab work is underway. By this point, police already have the couple's bank card records, and one detail has jumped out. On November 14th, they had bought tools at Home Depot. The receipts match what was found in the bags and in the apartment. The puzzle is locking into a tight, coherent picture. The initial missing persons theory turns, definitively, into murdered and hidden. The prosecution has everything it needs for trial: messages, videos, receipts, camera footage, witnesses, remains. All that's left is to take the case to a verdict. The trial begins in the summer of 2019. A Nebraska state court takes up the case of Audrey Trail on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecution builds a careful chain of documents and testimony: the Tinder messages, the camera footage, the Home Depot receipts from November 14th, the video the couple posted before their arrest, The statements of those women who had met with Boswell before Sydney and, for various reasons, walked away. From the beginning, Trail runs his own line. He tries to take all the blame on himself and shield Boswell, repeating that she had nothing to do with it, that he was the one who did everything. It isn't so much a defense as a performance. He talks a lot, interrupts often, behaves defiantly. The court is looking at a man trying to control the proceedings the same way he had controlled the scenario behind the scenes. In the second week of the trial, during his own testimony, Trail does something no one in the courtroom is expecting. He rises from his seat, shouts loudly, "Bailey is innocent, and I curse you all." He produces an object he had smuggled into the room in advance and inflicts a serious injury on himself, in front of the judge, the jury, the bailiffs, and the cameras. He is carried out of the courtroom on a stretcher. The wound takes about 100 stitches. Trail survives. The trial is paused for several days. National networks air the footage of the incident, and the Loofe case lands on the front pages again. When proceedings resume, the defense tries to use the episode, but prosecutors insist. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a staged act, aimed at an audience and at leniency. Investigators would later say plainly that he did it for the ratings. The jury doesn't buy it. In October 2019, Trail is found guilty on all counts. In June 2021, he receives the state's harshest sentence under Nebraska law. His courtroom stunt does not count as a mitigating factor. If anything, in the court's eyes, it fits into the larger picture of cold theatrics and manipulation. The other half of the couple remains. Bailey Boswell's turn comes in October 2020. Her trial is held separately, without Trail in the same room. The defense line is predictable. Boswell portrays herself as someone who was only following the orders of an older partner, someone under his influence, someone who didn't take anyone's life herself. Essentially, the same attempt to shift responsibility that Trail had made, only from the other side. The jury doesn't accept that version. On the table in front of them is the same evidence that convicted Trail: receipts, messages, statements from the women who survived their encounters with the couple, the denial videos, the camera footage. Every piece points to joint planning. Boswell is found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. In December 2020, she is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The appeals drag on, but without surprises. The Nebraska Supreme Court turns down the complaints one after another. In May 2024, Boswell's sentence is upheld for good. Before long, Trail's appellate options close as well. As far as the legal system is concerned, the case is finished. Criminologists classify this duo as a rare killing pair, offenders who operate only as a twosome and amplify each other. In the same category are well-known international cases where couples turned out to be more dangerous than any single offender. The Loofe case becomes a textbook example. It comes up in discussions about the safety of dating apps, in lectures for investigators, in materials about how a digital profile can be turned into a tool for hunting. Sydney's family keeps speaking publicly. Her mother and father give interviews, take part in memorial events, refuse to let their daughter become an anonymous file. To them, she remains the young woman who simply went on a date. Almost everything in this case is closed, except for one detail that no verdict can ever close. Sydney's upper left arm has never been found. It is still somewhere out in the fields of Nebraska, and every time someone nearby opens yet another app and swipes right on a stranger's profile, this story quietly reminds us it's still there. On the 22nd of August, 2012, a woman from Dublin walks out of her apartment carrying nothing but an old phone. Her bag, her wallet, and her usual mobile stay behind on the table. The next morning, her car will be found at the edge of the cliff in Shangana, and everyone will believe the same thing: that a depressed woman walked into the sea. They will go on believing it for a whole year. Until, in September of 2013, a drought strips bare the bottom of the Vartree Reservoir in Wicklow, and a dog up on Killicky Mountain comes back from the bushes carrying a human bone. That is when the unraveling begins of what the Irish press will later call the almost perfect murder, and the country will live with that one word, almost, for a very long time. The 22nd of August, 2012. Dublin is going through an ordinary late summer Wednesday. On the southern edge of the city, in Shangana Park, a soft Atlantic wind is blowing in off the sea. People are walking their dogs along the paths, runners are training near the water. Nothing in this evening hints that within a few hours this park will become the vanishing point of a 36-year-old woman whose name has not yet appeared in any police report. Earlier that day, Elaine O'Hara was discharged from the psychiatric unit at St. Edmundsbury on the outskirts of the capital. She had been there for several weeks. Her doctors noted improvement and let her go home. Elaine returned to her apartment, did a few ordinary things, started sorting out her belongings. By every outward sign, this was a calm day of recovery. Around 5 in the afternoon, the outdoor cameras at her residential complex catch her stepping out of the building. Her gait is steady, and her hands are almost empty. And it is exactly that almost empty that will later become the first strange detail of the case. At home, Elaine has left her bag with her documents, her wallet, and her keys exactly where they always are. Most importantly, she has left her main mobile phone, the one her family, her doctors, and her colleagues use to reach her. The only thing she takes with her is something she has never shown to a single person close to her. It is an old prepaid mobile, bought separately a long time ago and kept in a hidden place. The next morning, her car will be found at Shanganagh Pier, right at the edge of the cliff with the cold Irish Sea churning below. The version writes itself before the first detectives even arrive. Given her history of depression and her recent hospital stay, every single person believes it. And no one is yet asking the central question. What kind of phone was she carrying, and who exactly was she planning to write to or call from it on that quiet evening at Shanganagh Pier? That question, hanging unanswered over Shanganagh Pier, will not appear in the case file for many months. But in time, it is exactly what will lead investigators to a man hidden in one of the most ordinary corners of Dublin, in an office on Lower Baggot Street, and in a family home in Foxrock. For now, Elaine O'Hara's name is heard only in statements from her relatives. She was born on the 17th of March, 1976, and spent almost her whole life in Dublin. She worked as an assistant in a Montessori preschool. She loved the quiet rhythm of working with small children, the familiar little rituals of a small institution. Her world was built out of timetables, small errands, looking after others. People who knew her describe her as gentle, attentive, very patient, the sort of woman who remembered her colleagues' birthdays and was always ready to help. From her teenage years, Elaine had lived with severe depression and a borderline condition. Her state would ease and then come back, and she went into psychiatric units regularly. Doctors prescribed medication, psychologists built support plans. None of this was a secret to her family or to her close friends. But behind that clinical picture stood a real person whose deepest wish was simply for a steady anchor, for someone who would just be there, with no conditions and no judgment. Elaine looked for that anchor in different ways. During one of her lonelier stretches when the standard dating sites were not giving her any sense of closeness, she registered on a closed niche platform aimed at people with very particular interests. Her profile took on a strange, almost defenseless name, Help Me Learn 36. Read aloud, it sounds like a quiet plea. Help me learn. And in that single line, you can hear the voice of a person ready to trust whoever responds first. Through that one line, an entirely different kind of person will walk into her life. On the same closed site, under the username Architect72, a man registers who, on appearances alone, no one would ever place anywhere near a story about vulnerable women. Graham Dwyer was born in 1972 in the small town of Bandon in County Cork in the south of Ireland. He studied architecture, moved to Dublin, and built his career step by step, with no loud scandals and no noisy episodes. By the time he meets Elaine, he has been working for several years at the prestigious firm A&D Weishert and Partners on Lower Baggot Street, one of the main business addresses in the capital. From 2006, he is listed as a director of the company. He runs commercial projects, signs off on complex layouts, sits in meetings with clients. Colleagues respect his focus and his ability to take documentation all the way to the finish line. In 2002, in Sligo Cathedral, he marries Gemma Healy, also an architect, a calm, reserved woman from that same western county. A few years later, the family has 2 small children, joining his older son from a previous relationship. The whole life is laid out neatly. A house in the upmarket area of Foxrock, on the quiet Carrymount Close, Regular family outings, shared holidays, his usual morning runs. Neighbors know Dwyer as a fit, athletic man with a nice car and a tidy lawn. He has a separate hobby that he likes to talk about at social gatherings: radio-controlled model aeroplanes. On weekends, he drives out with other enthusiasts to open fields, sends his models up into the sky, and discusses technical details for hours. From the outside, it is the model life of a successful Dublin professional. House, family, position, hobby, and even circle of acquaintances. That outward perfection will later become the most chilling part of the story. Because behind that orderly routine, there lived a second life in which the username Architect72 was only one of several masks. That second life does not begin on mass dating services, not on Tinder, and not on the standard platforms where millions of people sign up. The site where the profiles Help Me Learn 36 and Architect 72 cross paths is a closed niche platform built around very particular kinds of role-based relationships, where one partner takes the lead and the other follows. Access is limited, active users know each other only by usernames, and most of the conversation moves quickly into private messages. The account Dwyer registers on this platform is linked to an email address with a very distinctive, recognizable name. That detail will later turn out to be crucial to the investigation. Through that very email address, detectives will eventually be able to tie an anonymous username to a real, identifiable man in Dublin. Around 2008, their profiles intersect for the first time. Dwyer writes first, and the conversation slips very quickly into deeply personal territory. Right from the start, he frames the contact as a teacher and student dynamic. He takes the role of the dominant figure, who explains, directs, and lays down rules. Elaine accepts the role of the one being guided, treats him as someone older, asks his permission about everyday matters. In-person meetings are added to the messages bit by bit. To keep the relationship hidden from his own family and from Elaine's circle, Dwyer introduces a rule from the very beginning: separate channels of communication. He buys cheap prepaid mobiles, registered under no recognizable name, and uses them only with each other. The messages on those phones never overlap with the regular accounts of either of them. No one suspects these two people are connected. Dwyer's wife in Fox Rock believes her husband is staying late at work or at a model aeroplane meetup. Elaine's relatives think of her as a lonely woman looking for friendship. The parallel life goes on for several years, and over time the tone of the messages grows darker. That shift in tone is not an accident. It is a slow drift in which fantasy starts to turn into something else entirely. What that tone slowly becomes will only come to light years later. Graham Dwyer, as will become clear from his own writings and his own messages, had been carrying very specific inner scenarios since his teenage years. At their center was an idea that was dangerous to another person, not abstract, but tied to a place and to circumstances. As a child and as a teenager, he had learned to live with this preoccupation and keep it inside. In adult life, that preoccupation never goes away. On the outside, Dwyer behaves like a successful architect and family man. On the inside, he keeps replaying the same scenarios. The anonymous closed site gives him something his ordinary life never could: a chance to talk openly about these fantasies with someone who does not flinch and does not walk away. In his messages with Elaine, he comes back again and again to the same theme. At first it looks like a game, like a ritual part of the relationship. Then the scenarios become more and more detailed: where exactly to meet, at what time, what to bring, how and where to go afterwards. Dwyer marks out a place in the mountains, mentions a reservoir, sketches out the logistics of what comes next. At the same time, he watches her state of mind very closely. In her hardest periods, Elaine writes about deep exhaustion, about losing her footing, about moments when living is very difficult. Most close people in such moments offer careful support, change the subject, steer the person toward doctors. Dwyer does the opposite. He picks up those phrases and weaves them into his own scenarios, turning her vulnerability into a tool inside someone else's plan. The messages are stored on both prepaid phones. Dwyer writes in the way people write when they are absolutely certain that this conversation will never reach anyone else. He has no idea that one of the great failures in his calculation will not have anything to do with digital security. It will have to do with ordinary Irish weather and with the water level in one small reservoir. That weather and that reservoir are still more than a year away. The summer of 2012 in Dublin is a hard one for Elaine. Her inner state slips back into the negative, and she goes back into St. Edmundsbury, the psychiatric unit on the outskirts of the capital where she has been admitted before. Familiar surroundings, familiar doctors, a familiar room. They examine her, adjust her therapy, hold regular conversations with her. By the end of August, the medical staff note an improvement. Elaine is composed, talks calmly, discusses what comes next. Discharge is set for the 22nd of August. By the standards of the ward, this is a routine day. Paperwork, a conversation with the doctor, instructions for further follow-up. In parallel, outside the hospital walls, another hidden conversation is going on. Through that old prepaid mobile that no one in her family or among her doctors knows about, Dwyer has been actively in touch with Elaine throughout these last weeks. He knows about her hospital stay. He knows when she is being discharged. And it is precisely on that day that he sets up a meeting. The place is chosen in advance, Shangana Park, on the southern edge of Dublin, near the shore. It is somewhere familiar to both of them, somewhere that does not trigger any particular alarm in Elaine. She agrees to come, tells no one about it, does not warn the doctors, does not let her family know. In the morning, she is collected from the hospital. She behaves the way she usually does after being discharged. Ordinary errands during the day, sorting things out at home, calm movement around the apartment. Around 5 in the afternoon, she steps outside, and the outdoor cameras catch her even, untroubled walk. Her hands are almost empty, just that one phone, the one Dwyer is on the other end of. From the outside, she is just a woman going out for fresh air after several weeks on a ward. Whether she truly understood what she was walking into will remain forever one of the heaviest questions in this story. That question is not asked aloud, not by her family, not by the first detectives. On the morning of the 23rd of August, Elaine's car is found at Shanganagh Pier. A modest Fiat, parked not far from the spot where she walked off the night before. Around it, the high cliffs and the strip of cold Irish sea hammering against them around the clock. Seen from outside for the first time, the picture seems to have only one meaning. Dublin police begin the procedures usual in such cases. They interview the family, they check the apartment, they note that the bag, the wallet, and the main phone are still at home. The family speaks calmly and in detail about her years of depression, about her hospital stays, about the discharge from St. Edmundsbury that has only just happened. The picture from her doctors and from her relatives lines up exactly. A vulnerable person, just out of a ward, left alone with the sea and a cliff. The version takes shape on its own before the search is even fully underway. Foot teams comb the shore. The Coast Guard works from the sea. A helicopter sweeps along the line of the waves. They are looking for a body, and they do not find one. But in Ireland, as in any country with a long coastline, the absence of a body is not seen as a refutation of that version. The sea takes what falls into it, and it does not give all of it back. The case is moved into the missing persons category, with a note suggesting a probable voluntary departure. The folder goes onto a shelf. The materials are reviewed from time to time, but active work is wound down. The relatives leave flowers at the pier, the doctors update a dry status line in her file, the wider public sees a short item in the local press, and after that, silence. No one is asking the central question that has been hanging over Shanganagh Park from day one. What was that phone, the one no one knew about, that she chose to take with her, leaving the usual one at home? That silence could have lasted indefinitely. The case could have stayed forever in the category of unconfirmed cases, if not for circumstances that depend neither on the police nor on the family. Those circumstances build slowly. The autumn of 2012 goes by, then winter, then spring, and almost all of summer 2013. In Dublin, the seasons change, shop windows change, agendas in the offices change. Elaine's friends and colleagues slowly learn to live with her absence. Her family keeps hoping, maybe somewhere along the coast, a small detail, a single object, will still surface. Graham Dwyer, in the same period, is living the ordinary life of an architect and family man. In the morning, the drive-in from Foxrock to the center, the office on Lower Bagot Street, projects, drawings, meetings with clients. In the evening, the trip home, dinner with his wife, homework and joint plans with the children, The usual conversations about school, holidays, renovations. Outwardly, nothing gives away the man who, exactly a year earlier, was involved in the death of another human being. His colleagues at the office notice nothing. Work moves along smoothly. The firm's reputation does not waver. At parties marking the completion of a big project, Dwyer carries himself the way he always does, calm, slightly detached, with that confident dry humor. On weekends, he drives out to open fields and sends his radio-controlled model aeroplanes up into the sky. The other enthusiasts in his hobby club see him as a tidy, focused man who can fine-tune complicated equipment and discuss it for hours. That outward steadiness rests on one specific belief. Dwyer is convinced that the central pieces of evidence of his second life lie at the bottom of the Vartree Reservoir in County Wicklow. He himself threw several items in there shortly after Elaine vanished, counting on the water to keep all of it hidden until the end of his days. The Dublin reservoirs are deep, access to them is restricted, and no one will go diving into the middle of one of them without a reason. That confidence holds for almost exactly a year. And then, in the autumn of 2013, it falls apart in a completely unexpected way, because of ordinary Irish weather, which that summer suddenly changes the rules. The summer of 2013 in Ireland turns out to be unusually dry. The rain that local people are used to almost stops for several weeks in a row. Fields go yellow, streams shrink, reservoirs slowly expose their bottoms. This kind of weather is rare for the country, and it gets discussed in the news as a curious anomaly, with no one suspecting what it is about to set in motion. The 10th of September, 2013, the Vartree Reservoir in County Wicklow, a few dozen kilometers south of Dublin. The water level here has dropped by nearly 20 feet, more than 6 meters. The bed near the bridge, normally hidden under a deep column of water, has been laid bare like a beach. Across it runs a dirty strip with stones, branches, and other debris that has been sitting on the bottom for years. That day, 3 local fishermen come out onto the bridge. The fishing itself interests them less than this strange new view that has opened up. They look out from the bridge at the exposed bed and notice something shiny lying in the mud. From that height, it is hard to tell what it is. A piece of metal, maybe, or something somebody dropped. Curiosity wins, and one of them climbs down for a closer look. What they find looks completely out of place in the middle of a half-empty reservoir. It is a bag with a set of items that would make any adult pick up the phone to the police on the spot. Restraints and other pieces of equipment. Clearly nothing to do with hiking or fishing. The bag has been in the water for a long time, and obviously does not belong to anyone who comes out here in season. The local police arrive, and after them the Garda Water Unit, the specialist diving team. Divers carefully sweep the area of the reservoir bed around the bridge, and they bring up from the bottom 2 mobile phones. They are old prepaid Nokias that have been sitting in the water for more than a year. From the outside, just a pair of soaked, unremarkable handsets. But in their memory, as the forensic work will soon show, are messages that will rewrite the entire investigation. While Garda experts are carefully drying out and preparing those 2 soaked phones for recovery, on the other side of Dublin, a second coincidence is about to happen, the one without which this whole story might have remained a bag with strange contents at the bottom of a reservoir. The 13th of September, 2013, only 3 days after the find at Vartree, a woman named Vergne is out walking her dog Millie in the Dublin mountains. They are on a familiar trail on Killicky Mountain in the Rathfarnham area, on the southern edge of the capital. It is a popular spot for walks, woodland, open slopes, views of the city. At a certain point, the dog turns aside into a thick patch of bushes, and a few minutes later comes back carrying something in her teeth. Her owner takes a closer look and realizes that it looks like a bone, and that this bone, most likely, is not an animal one. She stays on the spot and calls the police. A Garda team and forensic experts climb up onto the slope. At the patch of woodland where the dog led them, they find scattered human remains, fragments of clothing, and several personal items. Dental forensics, over the course of a few days, give a clear answer. These remains belong to Elaine O'Hara, who had disappeared exactly a year earlier. That one announcement changes everything in an instant. The idea that a woman walked into the sea at Shangana Pier collapses within hours. No one walks into the sea on the southern shore and then ends up in the mountains on the other side of Dublin. A person does not cover that distance by themselves after death. Someone moved her. Someone chose that spot in advance. Investigators officially open a case of unlawful killing, and almost immediately a parallel strand joins the work on the remains. Those two phones from the Vartry Reservoir, which by now are starting to yield to forensic analysis. Two coincidences, 3 days and several dozen kilometers apart, suddenly come together into one shared picture. That shared picture starts to appear on the screens in the Garda lab. Digital forensic specialists carefully disassemble both of the phones pulled out of Vartry. The casings are soaked, the contacts corroded, but the internal memory of the Nokias, as often happens with these simple models, turns out to be surprisingly resilient. After a few days of work, the data begins to come back to the surface. On one of the handsets, they find messages from a user who addresses the other person from the position of a master. On the second, there are replies from a user identified as Elaine. From the timing, the forms of address, the small everyday details, it is clear. These two handsets spoke almost exclusively to each other. What opens up in front of the investigators is a closed channel between two people, running for years. The messages span many months. This is not a series of isolated emotional outbursts. It is a systematic correspondence. The master figure describes in detail his plan in regard to his partner. He sets the place, works out the logistics, mentions a reservoir and mountains, ties actions to specific dates. Running through the text are details of her hospital history that only someone very close could have known. In parallel, detectives match the correspondence against her real discharge records from St. Edmundsbury, against her work schedule, against the accounts of her relatives. The overlaps are far too precise to be accidents. Every time the master wrote about some state of hers, or some plan of hers, those very events were in fact happening in her real life at that exact time. The image of a voluntary walk into the sea finally transforms into the image of a carefully planned crime. The bag of equipment found at the bottom of Vartry matches exactly the items mentioned in the messages. The remains on Killicky Mountain match the place discussed in one of the last stretches of the correspondence. That leaves the central question. Who was actually hiding behind the master username in that exchange? And the answer no longer lies at the reservoir or up in the mountains. It lies in an office on Lower Bagot Street and in a house on Carrymount Close. To get to that office and that house, Garda follow a digital trail that Dwyer, for years, considered safe. From the correspondence, they reconstruct the username under which the master had once registered on the closed dating site. Requests to the administrators of that platform give them the email address tied to that username, the one with the word fetish boy in its name. From here on, the methods are entirely earthly. A request to Google for metadata, a check on the IP addresses used to log into that mailbox. Some of those IPs belong to a home internet connection in the Foxrock area. Others belong to the corporate network of the architectural firm A&D Weichert and Partners on Lower Bagot Street. A cross-check against the internal user database of the dating site confirms the match under the second username, Architect72. And so, for the first time, a real name appears in the case file. Graham Dwyer, director of a respected firm in central Dublin, father of 2 small children, husband of the architect Gemma Healy. On paper, this man looks so mismatched with the image of the master from those text messages that the detectives double-check the links several times. Every check returns the same chain. In parallel, they pull data from mobile operators for the 22nd of August, 2012. The location data of Dwyer's work phone shows that evening, he was in the area of Shangana Park at exactly the time Elaine was last seen there. The overlaps are becoming too dense to stay as overlaps. On the 17th of October, 2013, a Garda team walks up to the house on the quiet Carrymount Close in Foxrock. Dwyer is arrested in front of his neighbors and in front of his own family. For a long time after, that morning will wrench this peaceful suburb out of its usual picture, and the neighbors will be left rethinking a great many things they had always taken for granted. At the search of the house, they seize computers, laptops, external drives, personal diaries, and notebooks. And within the very first hours of work on those devices, one thing is confirmed: the username Fetish Boy and the username Architect. 72 belong to the same man from Foxrock. That confirmed match instantly turns the whole case into something far larger than a single criminal episode. The equipment seized in Foxrock keeps producing material. On the drives, they find files that connect directly to the themes of the Vartry text messages, records and materials that follow the same logic as the messages from the master. This is no longer a guess and no longer an interpretation. This is the content of one specific person's personal devices. At the office on Lower Bagot Street, Dwyer's colleagues in those first days simply refuse to believe what they are hearing. Many of them have worked alongside him for years, discussed projects with him, seen him at corporate events. The image of a composed, calm director cannot be fitted onto the image of a man exchanging messages from a secret phone. Some staff refuse to speak to the press. Others turn up to work with obvious shock on their faces. Dwyer's wife, Gemma Healy, states in her very first interviews that she knew nothing about her husband's second life. She describes their family life as steady and predictable, shared plans, shared spending, a shared weekend routine. No deviations, no suspicious episodes, no sign of a second phone or of a second circle of contacts. Investigators find no grounds to doubt her words. The neighbors on Carrymount Close in Foxrock give similar accounts. A model family, a tidy house, a sporty father, keen on model aeroplanes. No rows, no strange visitors, no unexplained late-night trips. Exactly the outward picture that for years allowed Dwyer to keep his second life completely separate. The Irish press quickly finds a formula for this contrast. The phrase Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of Foxrock begins to appear in headlines. The image of the successful architect and the image of the man from those messages will not fit together in the minds of journalists or ordinary readers. And it is exactly that incompatibility that will become the emotional center of the upcoming trial at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin. That trial begins in January 2015. In those weeks, the Central Criminal Court of Dublin becomes one of the most talked about places in the country. Presiding is Judge Tony Hunt, a man with long experience of complex cases, known for his restraint and his precise way with words. The case is heard by a jury, 12 ordinary Dubliners, who now have to work through material unlike anything they have ever seen. The prosecution builds its case on 3 pillars. The first, the correspondence from the 2 mobile phones pulled out of the Vartry reservoir. The second, the mobile operator data showing the movements of Dwyer's work and personal phones on the day Elaine vanished. The third, the physical evidence, the bag of equipment from the bottom of the reservoir, the remains on Killicky Mountain, the material from the devices seized in Foxrock. The defense does not deny that Dwyer and Elaine were connected or that they had a particular relationship going back years. With that much correspondence, denying it would be pointless. The main line of the defense is different. It is about contesting the legal characterization of what happened and about disputing whether the mobile metadata is even admissible as evidence. The lawyers invoke European privacy rules and try to have part of the telecommunications data struck out of the file. Judge Hunt leaves the key evidence in the case. Dwyer's wife, Gemma Healy, gives evidence about the everyday side of their life, once again confirming that she had no knowledge of her husband's second life. Witnesses on Elaine's side, her family, her colleagues, her friends, describe her as a vulnerable woman, yes, but unquestionably alive, wanting to live, with plans and goals for the near future. What unfolds in front of the jury is a painstakingly assembled digital mosaic. Sections of the messages are read aloud, matched against dates and places, tied to a map of mobile movements. The process takes several weeks. By the end of March 2015, the main speeches have been delivered. The last witnesses have been questioned, and the jury retires to deliberate on the central decision in this whole story. That decision comes on the 27th of March, 2015. The jurors have spent several days together, going through the materials, rereading key fragments of the correspondence, matching them against the factual line of events. By the time they return to the courtroom, they have already arrived at a shared view, the same for all 12 of them. The foreman of the jury stands and reads out a short formula. The verdict is unanimous. Graham Dwyer is guilty of the murder of Elaine O'Hara. Inside the courtroom, Elaine's family, former colleagues, journalists from across the country. The family reacts with restraint, without loud emotion. For them, this moment means one thing above all. After 2.5 years of uncertainty, there is finally an official answer to the question of what happened to their loved one. Judge Tony Hunt hands down the life sentence mandatory under Irish law. Under the existing rules, that sentence follows automatically once such a verdict is returned. In his remarks to the defendant, the judge makes a statement that is unusual in his own practice. He says that he agrees with the jury 110%. That figure will be whispered around the courtroom for a long time after the session ends. Dwyer is led out of the room under escort. Outwardly, he maintains the same calm with which he has sat through the whole trial. That composure itself becomes a talking point in the press. Journalists search his face for any sign of an inner reaction and find nothing that goes beyond his usual self-control. The Irish media call this trial one of the hardest in the country's history. They compare the case to other major trials, but they note, in none of the previous ones was there such dense digital documentation of what had happened. Alongside the feeling that a chapter has closed, a separate story begins on the defense side. A series of appeals that will stretch across years and will eventually produce a national legal precedent. That precedent does not arrive all at once. Dwyer's defense files an appeal shortly after the sentence is handed down. The central argument is that same mobile metadata on which a significant part of the prosecution's case was built. In the view of the defense lawyers, using the operator's data violated European privacy rules and should never have been allowed as evidence in a criminal trial. The dispute drags on for years and turns out to be far more complex than either side had imagined on the day of the verdict. The Irish courts send questions to the Court of Justice of the European Union, wait for clarifications, return again to the key materials. In parallel, Irish legislation on the retention of telecommunications data keeps changing under pressure from European decisions, and each such change feeds back into the appeals. In March 2023, the Court of Appeal of Ireland delivers its ruling in the Dwyer case. The court rejects the appeal on the substance. In the judge's view, the metadata could legitimately be used in this case, and the conviction stands. The defense announces plans to take the ruling to the highest court. In July 2024, the Supreme Court of Ireland draws the final line. The highest court confirms that there are no grounds to overturn the conviction. The evidence used was gathered and presented within permissible limits. All attempts to challenge the verdict have been exhausted. The life sentence becomes fully and finally binding. The case becomes a landmark on the use of mobile metadata in criminal proceedings. Ireland changes its internal rules on the storage and use of telecommunications data, citing, among other things, the materials of this trial. Lawyers across Europe examine the decisions of the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court as a model for working with digital evidence. The story of Elaine O'Hara reaches far beyond the crime pages. From a private Dublin case, it turns into a wider conversation about how exactly digital traces outlive even the most careful planning. And that wider conversation slowly pushes Dwyer's name out of the public space, bringing back to the center of attention a very different name. That different name is Elaine's own. Years after the trial, it is slowly returning out of the shadow into which so many people had tried to leave it from the very first day. In the first months after she disappeared, Dublin knew her mainly as the missing woman with depression, as a short line in a police bulletin. After Dwyer's conviction, those close to her, year by year, kept steering the conversation somewhere else. Elaine was not a diagnosis. She was a living person, with her work, with the people she cared about, with her own plan for the coming weekend, and all of it was taken from her on one quiet August evening. In the press, a phrase takes hold, the almost perfect murder, with a very deliberate emphasis on the word almost. Without the drought in Wicklow, without the fisherman on the bridge above Vartree, without the dog on the trail at Killicky Mountain, this story might have stayed as a folder about a missing woman with a note suggesting a probable walk into the sea. A double stroke of coincidence pulled it back into the light at the exact moment when the inner calculations of the man behind the plan seemed to have worked out perfectly. Journalists and lawyers now study this case as an example of how a digital trace outlives even the most meticulous planning. An architect, used to building complex structures, did not account for one thing: that an ordinary mobile phone, thrown into water, is capable of bringing back to the surface, years later, everything that was ever typed into it. Our set of 3 online dating stories ends here: Tinder in Auckland, Tinder in Nebraska, and a closed site in Dublin. The platforms change, the countries change, the generations change. What does not change is the vulnerability of a living human being in the face of someone else's calculation. A calculation that knows how to wear any mask, including the mask of success and family happiness in a quiet suburb. The story of Elaine O'Hara does not leave us with an easy ending, but it leaves a hard lesson in paying attention. Attention to the signals we are used to letting pass in the most ordinary stories all around us.